Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at Nori, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Hey everyone, I'm your host, Ross Kenyon. I'm one of the co-founders of the Nori carbon removal marketplace. I almost never do this, but this is a rather unique show. I began programming this show because I have a lot of questions about open systems carbon removal. That's removal that takes place in a less controlled environment like the ocean or soil. How can we do science when there really isn't a single variable one can isolate? As a non-scientist, I feel like my model for understanding how science actually works is extremely limited. Predictably enough, if you listen to the show, was to read some books on the philosophy of science that I've neglected, specifically Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and Paul Feyerabend's Against Method. These are huge books for their discipline, similar to reading John Rawls and Robert Nozick in political philosophy. I'm going to explain them a bit here because Dr. Holly Jean Buck of the University of Buffalo and Anu Khan of Carbon 180 and myself dive in super quickly here and bounce between the books without frankly, a lot of concern for the audience, and that's probably my fault. It's hard to do a book clubby kind of show like this where there's a lot of asymmetry and information between the speaker and the listener. So here's what you need to know. Thomas Kuhn was a philosopher and historian of science active during the second half of the 20th century. Prior to Kuhn, a dominant idea in how science works is that there is just a gradual building of ideas within a coherent whole of science. If you compare to geology, it's uniformitarianism. There aren't that many big cataclysms that shape the world, just slow and steady change. Kuhn argued that scientists and really all knowledge workers have certain beliefs that shape their world that are very hard to see and challenge for both methodological and sociological reasons. Methodological because, well, let me put it this way. I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but during my time in Chicago, I had a communist friend and he denied that prices convey meaningful information. But pretty much every conversation you will have in your life takes for granted that prices are important because most people you speak with are liberals in the broadest sense, both conservatives, progressives. Most people are broadly liberal in their political tradition if you zoom out enough. His denying that prices convey meaningful information was basically having to go back to the equivalent of the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. What are some foundational things that we can build on from the very, very most lower bottom of reality? And it's actually really challenging to go back that far and reframe the entire discussion, both because we have very little practice doing it in our everyday lives, especially when we're talking about politics. We're not often going to that level of depth. And we have a lot of downstream knowledge that was produced upon the foundations of things like property rights matter, prices matter, constitutional government is important, things like that you take for granted. Most of our political discussions happen really far downstream from that. So since I was working within a broadly liberal paradigm and he was working from within a Marxist paradigm, that inter-paradigm conversation was pretty difficult. I don't think we made any headway at all, frankly. And so this is sort of what Kuhnian paradigms are like. It was actually really hard for me to imagine a world in which prices didn't matter because I believe that so strongly. And it was really hard for, I think, my interlocutor to think the converse. And so breakers of old paradigms and establishers of new paradigms, those are typically the names of scientists and many world leaders whom you know. Copernicus and Galileo for geocentrism, and then Einstein taking us from classical physics to relativity. People like that are the people whose names the lay person thinks about when they think about science. Most of the scientific work that happens accepts a paradigm and then works within it for knowledge production. For instance, if we know that force equals mass times acceleration, how does that help us put a rocket into space? One of those is extremely foundational, that equation, that conceptual understanding of how the physical world is governed, and then how we apply that knowledge to achieve some end state. And that application is what Kuhn deems normal science. That's often what people are doing when they're practicing science. Sociologically, why it's really hard to speak between paradigms, this has a little bit of a conspiratorial whiff to it. It doesn't have to, but it kind of does. It reminds me of that line that's often associated with Douglas MacArthur, that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. So in this case, it's old paradigms never die, they just fade away. Scientists are the ones who die and new ideas come along. So once people have been trained in a paradigm, that's their way of seeing and doing their science, they're trained in the tools within their paradigm of how things work, it's really difficult for them to throw it away. Just once people have been trained in doing things a certain way and they have decades of their life potentially built into the system, they're reaching the ends of their career, the top of it, they don't really want to see their life be thrown out as saying, oh, this is actually, we made some paradigmatic wrong turn. Most of the normal science within this is invalid or belongs in the graveyard of many of these discarded scientific ideas that we look back on, like Galenic humors, as being like, oh, isn't that quaint? I think there's a sociological reason to want to avoid that happening to your legacy as an individual. And then, of course, professions have this too. And you can see fights, even recent fights that have happened on this with plate tectonics, I'm told was an extremely nasty transition within geology. Surprising how brutal that was within that community. And there's just a lot of really strong feelings and protection over the knowledge that has been produced within a system. So there's a lot of inertia built into that. So Thomas Kuhn spends a fair amount of time dealing with that. And obviously it makes sense too. If you've ever had a religious conversion experience or a political one, it's a bit like that. If you have to tell your friends, your family, your social network that you are actually no longer a Muslim or a Christian, or you are no longer going to venerate your ancestors, or that you have become a libertarian or a socialist, or really anything like that, you will know that there is a lot of social pressure against group defection. These ideas are probably not blowing your mind for the same reason that if you go watch Citizen Kane, it looks a lot like films you've already seen because it pioneered a lot of the visual grammar and the storytelling techniques that followed it. So if what I'm telling you seems like, well, yeah, duh, it's because the book has just been that influential. Okay, so Paul Feyerabend, they're contemporaries. So Feyerabend and Kuhn, they're working around the same time, second half of the 20th century. And Feyerabend calls himself an epistemological anarchist. Epistemology is the study of what we know, of knowledge. And he's famous for the phrase, anything goes. It's sort of hard to read him in a non-postmodern way in 2024 because a common belief in contemporary times is that power operates through language, which is decisively not neutral, and the science is a reflection of those very same power relations. Knowledge production serves those in power, not truth, and what even is truth anyways? Hawley checks me on leaning too heavily into this reading since it may put him too neatly in a box that he doesn't belong within. Feyerabend makes the case that Ptolemaic astronomy was comparably accurate in predicting astronomical events as the geocentric model. If a method of knowledge production produces a useful result, it might still be useful even if the foundational assumptions are incorrect. Feyerabend is more like someone concerned about the loss of linguistic diversity around the planet. As the world becomes homogenized and there is a hegemonic way of understanding how the world works, languages that slice up reality in entirely different ways lose their place ordering the world, despite them having produced important understandings that are perhaps absent in other ways of structuring reality and our understanding of it. Feyerabend thinks scientific systems can be a bit like this, and it isn't that one paradigm is necessarily better than another, or that everyone that advances is better than the one previous to it. So we talk a lot about history and historiography, and one of the common schools of thought within history that's usually panned pretty hard, it's not super well respected, and it's more common in popular histories, and especially older histories, that it's called the Whiggish view of history, the Whig being an English political party, but the Whigs being people who thought the world was progressively becoming better over time. Humans are perfectible in a way, our institutions are getting better. And while that is true in some sense, I think many people would dispute that is the case. And in fact, there are times when history seemingly goes backwards and results in more barbarism, more cruelty, things like that. It isn't clear that history has a teleology, an endpoint that we're driving toward, that's something that's associated with someone like Hegel. This is more something like it's chaos. Basically, there is no God. There's no one in charge. It's just chaos. good things happen, bad things happen, and there's no sequentiality to it. There's just sometimes good, sometimes bad. So I personally think Feyerabend is a much better critic than a builder. So in Nietzsche's words, he calls it someone who philosophizes with a hammer. And those people are often pretty fun to read. But he does offer valuable prods against us getting too comfortable within any one paradigm. But I was left wondering what shape capital T truth is in after Feyerabend, in a very similar way to how I felt after digging into postmodernism and post-Rawlsian political philosophy within the analytic tradition. Just what do I do with this information now? Is there actually some foundationalist work we can do that allows us to build something that is syllogistically, self-evidently true? Does truth survive a way of understanding knowledge production in this way? So I end up getting caught there. Holly and Anu do not seem to get nearly so stuck on that idea, but that might just be how our brains work more than anything else. Now, if everyone could just join my meta paradigm, where we swap paradigms akin to flipping through filters on a kaleidoscope, we could all live as philosopher kings and queens. That's probably not going to happen, but that's sort of where I like to hang out. So I hope that is a pretty decent start to help you work your way through this. Oh, then one other note that doesn't fit into this big Kuhn Feyerabend part nearly as well, but I wanted to say, I tell a story in the show about how JFK stood down Curtis LeMay during the Cuban Missile Crisis and decided against launching a preemptive strike against Cuba, which would have almost certainly triggered nuclear Armageddon. And just to make an even stronger point about the role of contingency in history, Kennedy was reading Barbara Tuchman's excellent, outstanding book, you should absolutely read it, The Guns of August, about how the nations of Europe sleepwalked their way into World War I almost by accident. And so if you want to talk about contingency, what are the odds that Kennedy just happens to be reading that book at exactly the moment that he needs it? It's a beautiful, beautiful, terrifying idea. So hopefully that's a good start. Hope you enjoyed the show. That's the longest intro by far, but I love this content. It's super important. And thanks for listening. Welcome back to the show, Holly. You've been on Reversing Climate Change, I don't know how many times, and Carbon Removal Newsroom, at which you are a regular panelist. I'm glad to have you back.
It's a delight to be here, Russ.
A delight. I love that. That's great. And Anu Khan, Anu, we have not had you on previously, but I'm really happy that you were able to come on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I love that I'm here for this conversation because it's a wild topic, the structure of scientific revolutions.
It gave me a great sense of power that I could incent two very busy scholars to read some challenging books, several of them. They alleged to have read both of them to some extent. It's pretty good. I can't believe I had that amount of Svengali-esque power over each of you from a distance.
I think you're not accounting for what a big nerd I am. And I was like, an excuse to read this book.
So it's not me. It's your own individual nerddom. I feel similarly, though. I've known about these books for a long time. I was familiar with the arguments, but had never sat down and read them. So I like the opportunity to have read these. The books that we are reading and discussing today are Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and Paul Feyerabend's Against Method. Just broadly, did you enjoy this process? Was this new to you? Is it old news? In the general sense of it, how was this?
I mean, it's kind of nice to go back to grad school mood because being a professor is actually a lot about administration and bureaucratic tasks. And so it's fun to dive into some books.
Yeah, similarly, I spent a lot of my time thinking about carbon removal standards and really in the weeds of reading methodologies and how do they do that energy LCA part of this methodology versus this other one. So it was really fun to take this sort of 30,000 foot view of what are we doing here when we're doing carbon removal science and how does it fit into this broader, how do you describe it, historical and pedagogical framework?
Oh, yeah, that's what inspired this show. Nori, the company I co-founded, we worked in soil for a long time, which is a type of open systems carbon removal. And I've done several shows with scientists where the question of falsifiability has come up. Ideally, in a perfect scientific system, at least as pop culture wants to believe, you have some sort of physical system that is being observed, and you have isolated a single variable, and making a change on it, you can have a result that can then feed back and inform a new theory. But the type of science that's being done for open system CDR is not really like that. I'm not sure how it could ever be like that, because how could you have a single variable in a place like the ocean or in soil? I don't know. So what does science mean if you cannot have that simple falsifiability that you associate with people like Karl Popper and the caricature of positivism that people just have in their head, just because that's the dominant ideology of civilization at this point? And I didn't know where to go from that. I knew these books maybe had some clues. I'm not sure if all these clues pointed in the direction I had hoped they would, but it did make me think. And that's really the best thing I can hope for from a book at this point. Did it make me think or not? But I'm not sure it helped me solve this open system CDR, how do we practice science question. Did it solve that for either of you? That's probably too high of an expectation, I think.
I mean, I can say that for me, this reminded me about where we started from. Because I just feel like we're so much in a different point with what we mean by science right now versus even when these books were written. And so since then, we've had this idea of, quote, survival science or crisis disciplines like conservation biology that are emerging in response to ecological collapse, and like you're producing knowledge under this different set of conditions, which definitely means that you need to act before you have absolute certainty, and you're mixing in art and intuition. At least that's what the scholars who have written about crisis disciplines have talked about. So, there's that. There's the whole thing about post-normal science. I think both of those modes are really familiar to people working on a problem like carbon removal. But these books were kind of being written as that turn was beginning to happen. So it's fun to read.
Yeah. Yesterday, I was in a workshop that was all about what are the research gaps in carbon removal? How should scientific research centers, new and emerging and existing, think about supporting carbon removal as a field? And one of the things that was really interesting that emerged was this idea that we need to make a list of things to measure. It's not just one thing, but there's some list that if we measured all of these things, it would tell us what we needed to know. And then the next phase of the conversation was, we need to prioritize this list somehow because we can't measure everything. And then the next phase of the conversation was, what are we prioritizing for? Are we prioritizing to get really smart about techno-economic analysis and how quickly we can drive down the cost curve for certain technologies? Are we prioritizing for ecological impacts and environmental impacts and reducing harm or doing no harm and generating co-benefits? Are we prioritizing for any number of other things? But I think the big ones were the cost of carbon removal itself and everything else that happens. Oh, and there's a big conversation around, are we optimizing for resource management and all of the things that we could do other than carbon removal and putting carbon removal into that framework? And so I think that is what emerged for me in this sort of what is carbon removal science conversation. It's very much about what is the problem we're trying to solve for when we do this very directed and applied science in the context of carbon removal. And it's not always just, do we know where the carbon is, which is itself a hard enough question to address.
And I wonder if that's even science or if it's engineering. I mean, if you're making a list of things to measure, which bucket would you put it in?
Yeah, I think it's some aspect of both. And I think we were just talking about this, that the work that we're discussing is from the 60s and the 70s, post sort of big chemistry and physics revolutions. And at least my scientific training in the 2000s was much more in this interdisciplinary. We recognize that our science is much more applied and directed towards sort of things that we're going to build in the world. And so I wonder if my conception of scientific training is really different from what these authors had in mind, because I was trained in a paradigm that was inherently interdisciplinary. You were told over and over again that your science is applied science. It is for something. And only the super duper smart people get to do fundamental science, which is just math.
You're just a normal scientist. as Kuhn might say. Whenever you say paradigm, I want it to be like a Pee-wee's Playhouse, where that's the word of the day and we all scream. I don't know if you guys grew up watching that. No, not really. Holly's smiling, so maybe a little bit. God, there's so much to say about this. I don't even really know how to dive in. The interdisciplinary part of this is pretty important. I wonder if this is clearly a response to maybe scientists being so cloistered that they forgot about the world outside. They become so enamored with their ideas that they forgot about the social repercussions of them, or that there are other disciplines that can bring in ideas that might reinforce their work or challenge their work in important ways. Do either of you know what led to that change and how the academy was structured?
I wouldn't say it's really changed yet.
Oh.
It's one of those things where it's more of a buzzword than actually realigning institutions and incentives.
How do they incent that in the academy?
Well, like if you wanted people to do interdisciplinary work, then you need to like revise tenure and promotion criteria to make that work legible. So it's like read from different people or, yeah, I think that's one of the main things people talk about. But I mean, even just setting up like jobs in this space, right? Even now, most people, they'll hire you to do interdisciplinary work, but you need to be like in a department of X or Y or Z. And that's like kind of what really matters to your career trajectory. So, we recognize the ideal of interdisciplinarity, but haven't mainstreamed it yet.
That track with your experience, Anu?
Oh, I got out a while ago. I left in grad school, so I'm a terrible metric for interdisciplinarity. But maybe it tracks in the sense that I left grad school and now I work in carbon removal, very much trying to figure out where the threads are around industry and academia and policy and the whole kind of like nest of weird stuff that is necessary to grapple with if you're thinking about carbon removal as a public good that we don't quite know how to measure yet.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. That's pretty far downstream, but super important. I think we should start pretty close to the fundamentals here with philosophy of science. And Holly, since you're on, I need to quote the Bible. It's just sort of something that I need to do when you're on the podcast. But I don't want to go all Pontius Pilate on us, but what is truth? Like what exactly is objectivity and truth? Is this a possible ideal within science? I think the average person, if you ask them, would say, yes, it still exists. Yes, it's possible. It's desirable. And people like Feyerabend are just saying, we need a pluralism. There's multiple knowledges that can be constructed, and we do well for ourselves, and we do not have power saying this type of knowledge is legitimate, this other one is not. I'm also nervous about that too. The expression that I've heard for this, it's not a very careful phrase, but don't let your mind be so open that your brain falls out. I also don't want to do that either. I think if you take Feyerabend seriously, you have to start biting the bullet that there are things that are maybe not true, that are maybe more mythological, that are symbolic. And I'm not sure how you evaluate truth claims within Feyerabend at that point. I don't even know what to do with it, but I like the ideas. So anyways, is there truth? Is there objectivity? What do we do with all these ideas?
Well, I mean, did you read this book as being just completely postmodern? I mean, I wasn't sure that that's what Feyerabend was saying. Like he says anything goes, but I don't know if that exactly means like every truth claim is equally valid.
I think that's right. I think he does a better job of breaking things down than building up something else. But I'm not really sure how we evaluate truth claims or how to even approach a statement like I just made from within an anything goes kind of framework. Because in a sense, it almost sounds kind of like positivism to me. Like, does it lead to results that are actionable? In which case, okay, anything does go if that's the case. And how you get there is sort of irrelevant to the results. But I could be reading him wrong. So feel free to push back if you think I've misread.
For me, they're interesting question. I spent less time with Feyerabend, so maybe less able to assess those questions. But the question of like truth is just so gnarly. I feel like I would need to spend years thinking about that question.
I mean, they killed Socrates for questions like that. It's pretty annoying. I get it.
Yeah, rude.
Oh, no, I mean, so what do you think is the main project of this book? So I think the project is to just open up how people approach science and to encourage them to, proceed against intuition and test out new and different stuff, because that's what they needed to do at that time. So, I think how we would read the book today, we're in a different space because we had postmodernism in so many forms. And now, we've really opened up this question of what is science? What is truth? Is everything, every perspective equally valid? We have a lot of robust, interesting conversations around indigenous science and, how to include that in something like impact analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act. Like those kind of questions are a thing now that would not have been a thing at this time this book was written. So, this question about what is truth, I don't think that was the part of the main project necessarily.
I think what jumps out to me from what Holly was saying about the opening up of the process and the conversations that we're now having about things like including traditional indigenous knowledge in the scientific enterprise is how incomplete that activity is. And thinking about specifically through the lens of sort of carbon removal science and carbon quantification science, the extent to which, going back to Kuhn, normal science is still very much the way that we think about chipping away at uncertainty and what we're trying to measure and the list of things that we're trying to measure. This whole, we are in a different place than when these books were written, and yet we're very much in an incomplete transition phase. We're in this period between revolutions, or even we're still in this paradigm and we're sort of incrementally chipping away at something that might come next.
Yeah, I think that's a nice little point to make. And I agree, Holly. I don't think the fundamental nature of truth is really what Feyerabend's after. I link this to my undergrad degrees in history, and one of my favorite courses I took had a strong historiography focus. It was very much about how we practice history and some of those meta questions. And what I liked about it is that as any type of scholar, you should be able to flip between paradigms relatively fluidly. There's something that I always find disappointing about someone who only has one way of seeing things and that's all they can do. In that historiography course, there was, okay, well, the great man theory of history was a thing that was important back in the day, like Napoleon. If there was no Napoleon, the course of world history would have changed. And then you had other approaches, especially I think I associate this with Howard Zinn and new left historiography of saying like the masses are basically what matters. Like the broad tides of history and the quantity of humanity is what makes up and drives history. But there's also cases where even inside of history where the example I like to think of is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK stood down Curtis LeMay, who wanted to have a preemptive strike on Cuba. And JFK said no, and he went for the quarantine and the blockade approach instead. And if there was a different president, different personnel, the world would have ended. We would have had nuclear war because someone would have listened to Curtis LeMay and JFK didn't. But it's also possible that we would have ended up in the same spot anyways, just because all of those historical forces pushed us to that place. So I'm able to use both of those paradigms at the same time to have a nuanced understanding of this. I think that's what Feyerabend's trying to do too. And your linkage, Holly, especially to indigenous knowledge and what's happening now. I think if you can say Western science teaches us this and other systems of knowledge might add this to the mix, I think being able to hold those and swap between them without being too obsessed with any one of them that you lose track of the broader picture, I think that's what he might be pointing toward. Or maybe that's just my bias because that's a conclusion that I want.
Yeah, I would agree. He has this passage where he talks about voodoo and the Hermetic writings and how they influence Newton and all of this stuff. And it's like you get something from these other forms of knowledge and belief systems. It's all valuable. That was my takeaway from that passage.
Yeah, I read a history of the occult recently, and Newton being into alchemy and being pretty strange in that way was a surprising fact to me.
I have a question. Does against method have its own definition of a paradigm? Because one thing you said in your last question was like your ability to switch between paradigms. And is it a paradigm if you are able to switch between them?
I think Kuhn would say no. I think he would say you kind of live within it. You were trained in this. All of your incentives sociologically are to not stray from the paradigm. Paradigms change when old scientists die, essentially. No, I'm not using it in a Kuhnian way. I'm not even sure I'm using it in a Feyerabendian way, if that's even the correct adjective. I think I just am using it in the colloquial. Kuhn and paradigm before Kuhn was just a weird Greek word that no one used. I think it was basically him that now it's an idiom. Now it's everywhere. But you are correct. I think procedurally, I am not using this word carefully. You caught me.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what you're describing is like what in Kuhn, he had it as like a change of worldview, a change of view, not a change of the world, that you're looking at the rabbit and the duck and you've gotten yourself to a place where you can just see lines and call it a rabbit or a duck if you want to. But, and that was like the breakdown of the visual analogy with the paradigm. So the paradigm you can't get out of.
Yeah, I'm saying, well, I'm so smart and so cool that I can see both a rabbit and a duck, depending on what serves my interests at any given time. Yeah, you're right. That's probably not the right way to use it. Well, I don't know what I would call it instead. It's just a way of seeing, or I think all of those paradigms or whatever we want to call them in the way that I use them, they illuminate some things and they obscure some things as well. Like they do that at the same time.
It's also interesting that you mentioned the sort of like great man theory of history or historiography, because Kuhn is in that frame too. Like he's challenging all these paradigms, and then right in there, he's like, also, funny thing, these were all like young men that decided how to change science. Like, well, that is itself a pretty small box in which to contain your expectations about scientific revolution.
Yeah, that's true. If it wasn't Galileo or Copernicus, would it have been some other person several weeks later that would have done something quite similar? I don't know. I think some people would say, yes, it would have happened. It was almost inevitable. Once the forces of history were at work, there's a dramaturgical sense of that too, right? Like we're on a stage, there are actors who come to play this role. And if someone is left out of this role, someone else will come in. I think I don't know if you've seen Synecdoche, New York, that Charlie Kaufman movie, but I think that's a way of seeing history, I would say. Ooh, is this show going off the rails or is this fantastic? I can't tell. Holly, what do you think?
I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot in relationship to solar geoengineering, actually. And you could imagine that field in particular is one where an individual and their psychology and their ego and whatever's going on with them might have an impact on world history in that kind of way that you described with the Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever, where it's just a little bit random in a frightening way. So I do think we have to think about like the whole person that's doing the science and their psychology and motivations and bring that more into our understanding of what's going on.
Ani, does this help you with your MRV work, or is this just entirely external to your thing? Like, will this inform any of your work?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Thank God.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, making things about MRV is my useless superpower. I think what jumped out to me in reading Structure of Scientific Revolutions and this discussion about paradigms and how they are both social and sort of like technical and pedagogical, I think I hope we are at a point of a potential paradigm shift in how we think about carbon removal and carbon markets, where our like social construction of the problem, and therefore the science that we do within that construction of the problem, is very much about markets and carbon as a currency as the dominant form of carbon removal activity. And I think I see elements of like crisis and transformation that maybe we're moving towards something that isn't just carbon crediting, as the way we think about and do carbon removal. And we're thinking about things that are more like sector level accounting of fluxes and other funding mechanisms and the science and infrastructure and apparatus and instrumentation that would arise from that alternative paradigm. And as I was going through the book, I kept he would talk about different things that show up in crises. And I'd be like, oh, I think this is happening in carbon removal. I think people are discontent and there's a proliferation of other
anomalies out there.
Yeah, there's some anomalies. There's some near facts that are being transformed into evidence of a shift. So I found it really, really interesting to apply this sort of framework of revolutions to a lot of what I'm seeing and how we think about carbon removal. Is carbon a currency, or is there some other way of thinking about this problem? And in particular, the MRV piece of it, I think, is the puzzle solving character. If you think of the puzzle solving in the paradigm for carbon removal, we're definitely going to get a credit out of the end of this thing. And the puzzle solving is how do we do the pieces of MRV in order to get a credit? And it's you could come up with really cool and clever ways to do this. Or you could be wait, or why am I assuming there's going to be a credit at the end of this process? So all of that to say, I love this book, and I have a lot of thoughts about how it applies to carbon removal.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you just said about the possibility of transformation is exciting and also daunting. And so I think there's a good version, which for me would be in a more public good or even socialist frame. And then there's a dangerous version where people implement these practices of more of a religious motivation, which again could be good, but it could be bad. It could have bad impacts. So I guess I'm informed, not just thinking about carbon removal, but thinking about solar geoengineering, which has a lot of these uncertainties. And you could imagine that, some people in the future decide to undertake it based on faith because they might not have the rigorous infrastructure for monitoring set up or whatever. And they just keep doing it out of ritualistic hope. I think you could see the same thing with carbon sequestration in different forms too. And there could be a spin on that where it's oh, we're in this happy, post whatever old paradigm where we've opened up the box and how we think about this, but you could also see it being a disaster. So does that make sense? Those different futures.
It's old climate paradigms as cargo cults, essentially. The focus on carbon crediting is something that I think a lot about. I work at a marketplace, and there are parts of this that I am uncomfortable with as well. And one of our team members, I'm sure he'd like to shout out right now, Patrick So, who's our head of product. He would very much like to be selling the assets that we're creating based on acreage for farmland converted to regen, rather than tons of carbon dioxide. But we're so path dependent. The world's been thinking in terms of a ton of offset for a ton of fossil fuel, even though that's wrong for a very long time, assuming that it's just classical offsets. But trying to educate them, it's been 30 years and they're still pretty bad at it. And we've been talking, I remember being a kid hearing about the CDM and Kyoto, and it's still, they just have that one idea in their head, and that's all that it is. And so having to do a business that's already difficult and educate them about something else when someone else is selling them the product that they've come to be educated to expect, that's really hard as a business. So I'm not sure how, maybe you just said the solution is something that's more socialist, something that's more industrial policy, as Will Burns might say, something else. But I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that as a business person, because it's pretty tricky, because I think that actually might be a good solution, but then my job is just yelling into the void, perhaps.
But I think business people change their models when there's some new viral idea that reaches a certain tipping point and they're hearing it from the messengers that they respect. Don't you think this happens a lot?
I guess, but who are the messengers they respect? It's probably not me. It's probably people like Al Gore and whoever is on stage at TED or whoever is going to Azerbaijan this year. It's not going to be me. So am I just like isolating myself from the dominant paradigm here?
Yeah, maybe you just need to keep making podcasts that sneak the idea to other people.
I think they're listening to a show with their peers on it. I think I'm running like a weird little freak show over here that I'm proud of, but I don't think those people are. If you're out there, John Kerry, if you're listening right now, like send me a note. I'd like to know.
I think it does make a difference if we are, well, paradigm change because you've clearly articulated an alternative, right? And I think that piece has been super challenging because the dominant paradigm isn't just about climate. It's about like our entire society and like capitalism and blah, 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 like all these things, right? That are so deeply tied to our like well-being as individuals. I think there are three sort of threads that I wanted to pull on in response to what you and Holly were saying. The first is the challenge of clearly articulating an alternative paradigm. The one that we're in is so pervasive. It's not really about carbon or climate. It's just like about everything and how we operate in society. So articulating an alternative just for the little bit that's a carbon or climate problem and is sufficiently compelling, I think is one of the problems that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And even just like, are there narrow slices where we can articulate an alternative to crediting? It's just, for this pathway in this point in time, can we do acres or something like that? The other thread that came up from your comments about sort of like John Kerry and Al Gore and like who's influential. I talked to a lot of folks about this question of like who gives companies permission to purchase in an alternative paradigm, right? Because you have like the whole net zero, SBTI, corporate goals. Those have to be tied to metrics that are tied to finances, so your CFO can sign off on it. So thinking a lot about like who does give companies permission to try different things, because what they're doing is spending money on climate and getting some numbers out the other side. And then I think the third thing, and this is a little bit going back to Holly's earlier point of point that I take to be like, what if the alternative paradigm is worse? If you have like crediting, at least you're getting numbers out of it. You have some data that you generate. And what if the alternative is just like, we just have to deploy as quickly as possible and we don't have to measure anything. We just have to go and like do the thing. And that does seem somewhat plausible to me, that we get to a point where climate is like bad enough that this pseudo-rational crediting mechanism is displaced by a more aggressive, like we just have to do the thing. And I hear that sometimes in sort of spaces and conferences and things of like, you don't appreciate how bad it is. Like you don't understand, this is so bad, we have to do this kind of thinking. But it circles back to that first point of how do we clearly articulate an alternative and do so in a way that's like a small enough experiment that you could actually try, right? Sort of this from Kuhn, isolating and precisely articulating the outlier as the first step in a paradigm shift.
I think what would come about even as a next paradigm, it could be something that was far more holistic and far more policy based, certainly possible. It could be still within the crediting paradigm. It'd be a kind of sub paradigm. I heard Ryan Orbuck on Shale Khan's podcast a couple of months ago, or maybe it was even longer, advocating for credits to be denominated in terms of radiative forcing. That's a nightmare. I don't even know how you educate a customer in that. That's worse than my idea. It might be more true, but it's not easier to get action on. But I like that it was outside of normal thinking. I don't think it's going to be something like that, but it might be something about biodiversity and carbon and the water cycle and the social benefits and environmental justice. It could be something like that. Certainly that is a younger generation set of ideas that's coming about that might have power. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I never really understood why CDR wasn't just a subset of ecosystem services stuff.
Do you not think it is? I think some people do think of it that way. No?
I mean, when you're thinking about your credit, are you are you getting streams from different services, or is it only carbon?
We have fellow travelers who do try to do a more thoroughgoing ecosystem services approach, but even doing carbon well, and that's relatively well understood, super hard. We've been doing this for 7 years, and there's still open questions that we try really hard in good faith to deal with, and it's challenging. So I can't imagine also having to deal with water and biodiversity and everything else on top of it. Maybe others can do it. Maybe smarter people can figure it out, but I don't know that it's super simple. And then also you have to educate a customer being like, okay, you have to buy 1.3 biodiversity credits for this piece of land and half of a water credit. And I don't know, my brain hurts even trying to come up with a theoretical here. You can smack me down though if you think if I'm way out.
What comes to mind for me when I hear these conversations about the increasing complexity of generating rigorous and valid, in some sense, environmental attribute credits is the part of a paradigm shift that is not necessarily scientific, but about the aesthetics and like the neater, simpler solution. And I often have these conversations about MRV and carbon removal where we're like, to make it better, we have to make it so complex. There have to be so many people, so many things we measure, so much that goes into this package. And like, is there a simpler thing we could do? And the policy shift that I often think about, not to say that this is like what's going to work, but I think is maybe worth testing is, can we do sector level accounting of fluxes or facility level accounting of fluxes, taking out some of the additionality, baseline, and counterfactual questions that we use for credit generation, and recognizing my own bias is sort of mapped back to scientific revolutions. There's a part of me that it just really likes that it's simpler. Like I just want it to be easier for me to do this accounting. And that is like part of the appealing aspect of a potential shift.
I respect the approach. I certainly think we need approaches that allow for ease and scalability. I think the industry has clustered around this idea of precision uber alles, essentially. And that's good, but it isn't good for its own sake. I think if it helps get us to faster PPM, it increases trust to the degree that allows us to scale that much faster, then okay. But I think maximizing for any attribute feels asymptotic to me. And it's like you get to 80-20 and every additional percentage of precision, I feel like adds that much more hard work for the suppliers. And it's like, I don't even know that it gives you that much more validity to the carbon claim. Maybe it does, maybe it's worth it, but I think people take it for granted. And I never mind it when someone wants to throw it out and start afresh. I'd like to hear more about your proposal. I don't know what it means for it to be sector based rather than something else, but I'd love to know about it.
Yeah. So I should say this is very early days thinking of just like really desperately wanting to articulate an alternative that we can at least test, because there seems to be so many challenges with the current paradigm. But I think particularly for open system CDR solutions, thinking about crediting being one part of a broader set of funding mechanisms for drawdown activities, where, for example, if you did want to have like a really robust offset, you could do a very rigorous set of measurements to quantify CO2 and attribute it to a specific activity, like at the field scale. Alternatively, you could imagine a scenario where you are, for example, deploying enhanced weathering for soil pH management as one of a set of possible soil amendments for agricultural reasons and sort of agronomic benefits. And then at the, say, like watershed, river system, jurisdiction level, building out a system of river gauges that would allow you to check over time for changes in total alkalinity and incorporate that through the use of appropriate models and parameters in a national greenhouse gas inventory. So what you're doing is you're trying to solve for a soil pH problem that may, in a local context where there's, lime or silicates available, be an appropriate agronomic solution. And then also checking through a different level of monitoring if there was a carbon drawdown benefit or impact that should be accounted for at the jurisdiction scale. So stuff like that is kind of where I hang out these days.
What do you think about that, Holly?
Yeah, I guess I'm still thinking back to Kuhn and all this stuff that he writes about puzzles. Do you remember this part? It's like the point of normal science is to better apply the paradigm with the same kind of scope. And, people within this normal science, they're really into solving puzzles with established rules. And when I hear all of this and I think about CDR, MRB, I just think about the puzzle solvers. And I don't know, maybe we could come at this from a whole different direction than that.
I mean, one counter to it that I heard, I was reading that new book, Climate Capitalism, and he quotes Noam Chomsky in there saying that it's too late to resystem away from capitalism in time to deal with climate change, and that we essentially need to use the tools in front of us. So maybe we don't want to confuse the puzzle solvers. Maybe they need to be working on the best way to deliver carbon credits, and something else is probably too far away, requires too much education to switch and time to make a difference. That is totally open. You can disagree with it as an assertion, but interesting idea.
Yeah. I think that's I personally find that to be a pretty compelling argument. And sometimes I'm in spaces where we're trying really hard to design ideal systems for making carbon removal work. And then someone, usually with an industry background, is like, you just need demand. If you pay people to do it, all of the other problems will get solved. Like the pipeline, the talent, the MRV, all of it. If you have demand, it'll just solve the rest of the problem. And I'm like, and again, going back to that sort of aesthetic quality that's appealing, I'm like, yeah, I kind of see the logic. If you just really lean into the capitalism of it all, maybe it does solve the rest of your upstream problem.
All right, Holly's winding up over here. I can just feel it in my bones.
No, I mean, I've heard these same things too, but it's just so not true. And we're forgetting the main demand, which is the demand of the public to pay for this. And whenever I do a focus group just with regular members of the public who have never heard about it, they're like, well, how much is this going to cost? I don't know. I can't even afford X, Y, and Z because of inflation. It's that's the ask and the demand that all of the people, I think, in the CDR space are kind of ignoring. Maybe that's unfair, but so I think about, okay, if we had that demand, maybe, but how do we get that demand? What are the structural obstacles? And, I think of things like the political economy of the internet and so on, to getting to the consensus level about even the shape of the problem to be able to then get to that demand for carbon removal at scale.
When you think about the puzzle solving component and how the puzzle solving process has a predetermined outcome, what is the predetermined outcome that you have in mind in our existing paradigm?
Well, I mean, I think you described it well earlier when you were talking about, a robust credit that somebody can exchange, right? It's to move along that whole economy of the exchange.
I like it. I think that's a good way to put it too, because you really, okay, I'll back up a second. Feyerabend has a bunch about John Stuart Mill, which I thought was pretty interesting that he likes John Stuart Mill so much. I also like John Stuart Mill. It's come up on the podcast several times that I always forget if it's him or Edmund Burke, but they both have a similar line that there's always a party of order and there's always a party of progress. And you don't just want one or the other. Well, maybe some people do, but if you only have the party of progress, you end up with guillotines. If you only have the party of order, nothing ever changes and evolves. Probably don't want either of those for the most part. So you need to have them in tension with each other. And in that same way too, at a company or even in any organization, you have some people that are outside the box thinkers who are coming up with new ideas. But that's sort of what I am and do. But if you only had a company of me's, I don't think it would work very well. You also need those linear puzzle solvers who are actually building stuff in a very stepwise kind of way. Because if you only have paradigm shifters, I don't think you ever get a chance to solve any puzzle. I think you just sit around in a book club like this, which is fun, but I don't know that it changes the world in the ways that we need. So I think having an ecology of beliefs like that, you need different types of personalities, you need different types of approaches, and I think that sort of friction and dialectic can be really powerful in a good way. Also very frustrating though. It means you never really come to a finite conclusion that we all walk away happy from. It's all synthesis and debate, and maybe that's what we did here today. But it was kind of fun. Did you have fun? Are you not entertained?
I am very entertained. I love the opportunity to think about the paradigms in which we're operating in carbon removal, and also think about how we are making this sort of progress within the paradigm that we're in. Like, people are starting to build carbon removal solutions. They're starting to get more information about what works and what doesn't work and what the challenges are. And it's fun to zoom out and think about the overall structure of the problem. But I think most of us are in our day-to-day lives just kind of like, yeah, solving our puzzles and seeing how we do. And thank you for inviting me on. This was really fun. Not what I thought I would spend my Friday thinking about.
More to come, I'm sure. I'm glad to have you on it for your first time. And Holly, thanks for being here too. Would you like to have the last word?
No, I guess maybe we should reiterate anything goes, but I'll add my cautionary note.
Okay.
Maybe
what's
anything
the
goes
cautionary note?
question mark. I think that people would read that principle today if they hadn't read the book as just kind of throwing out the scientific method generally. And, that's not what this book's project was about, and also not what we should be doing when it comes to carbon removal or climate science or anything else. I think dangers look there. And I liked what both of you pointed to is like being able to hold up different systems of knowledge and, move between them and understand when one works and when another works. And like, that's just the level of sophistication that if our society could get there, it'd be really, really exciting. I think it reminds me of negative capability, like Keats wrote about in literature, like just being able to dwell with some uncertainty and, flexibility. Like, could that be our new mode going forward?
Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.